Today's video is part 2 of a series I've been doing on agency. Now, agency is a very important key real estate term and concept that you need to know for your real estate licensing exam. Now, I already did video number 1 or part 1 of this series. I'm going to put a link right up here in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you have not watched that one yet, please go watch that one and then come back to this one because one video builds upon another. And just a quick recap here of what we talked about here in the first video. Remember, we talked about the agent, who is the real estate agent, or sometimes called the licensee. All right, these are the same person. Agent is the real estate agent or licensee. Now, they are the same person, and they're at the core of the center of every real estate transaction where a licensee is involved. All right. Then we talked about, in the previous video, what's called the fiduciary duties that the agent or licensee owes to their client. There are 6 fiduciary duties. We discussed them in detail. So that was the first part of this series. In today's video, we're going to discuss part 2, which is the classifications of agency. First video was about the fiduciary duties and those 6 fiduciary duties that the agent owes to the client. Today we're going to talk about the classifications. Now, classification number 1, the first one I want to talk about is what's called special agency. Special agency. Now, special agency has 4 key points that we have to understand. The first one is it's for one specific action or act. Now think about this. I'm a real estate agent with a license, and the seller hires me to sell their house. So I'm going to make sure that I give them all those fiduciary duties that I owe them. But it's for one specific act. The classification when I'm selling somebody's house is special agency. That is the type of agency that I have with the seller. All right, and part of that is one specific act, meaning my only job is, the one thing is to sell the seller's house, period. All right, it also requires that there is a limited, having a hard time spelling here. I need to slow down. It's a limited time, a limited purpose, and there's a limited authority. Now let's look at each one of these. One specific act. My job is to sell the house. That's it. However, I have a limited amount of time to sell that house, and that is determined by the listing contract and how long that listing contract is. A limited purpose. Again, the only job I have is to sell that property. And then limited authority. I cannot speak on behalf of my client in any way. So let me give you an example here. Let's say that I'm doing an open house on my seller's property that I have up for sale. Somebody comes through, a prospective buyer walks through and says, "Hey, Paul, I'll offer, why don't you talk to your seller? Let's see if they'll take $200,000. Now, even if I've had previous conversations with my seller and that seller has indicated to me that they will take $200,000, I still can't speak on behalf of my client and say, "Oh yeah, my seller will take that." I have to tell the buyer, "Great, thanks for the offer. Let me talk to my seller or my client and see what they want to do. I'll be back in touch with you." All right, so special agency is for one specific action. It's for a limited time, limited purpose, and limited authority. That's the first classification. Now, there are some subcategories of special agency. The first one is what we call limited buyer's agency or limited tenant agency if I'm representing a tenant. Now, all the same rules apply. I still owe all the fiduciary duties to my buyer or my tenant, and the type of agency that we have between me, the licensee, and that buyer is special agency. So think about it. That buyer, I'm limited to representing the buyer in that real estate transaction. And it's for one specific action, meaning I'm going to find a house for my buyer to buy. It is for a limited time, right? So as soon as I find a house for my buyer to buy, or we separate we mutually agree to part ways, that's the limited time, limited purpose, limited authority. I can't speak on behalf of my buyer just like I can't speak on behalf of my seller. All right, the second subcategory is limited seller, agency, or owner in the case of a property, in the case where I have a home for lease. So maybe there is an investor that's hired me to lease their property. It's limited seller's agency or owner agency. Again, I owe all the fiduciary duties to the seller, and special agency exists. And again, that one specific action is to sell the house. It's for a limited time, limited purpose, limited authority. I think you get the picture where I'm going. The next one is a little more complicated. It's called dual agency. Dual agency. This is where I'm going to represent the buyer and the seller, or the tenant and the owner, in the same transaction. So let me give you an example. I have a house listed for sale, and I do an open house. A prospective buyer walks through and says, hey, I want to make an offer. At that point, I say, listen, before you move forward, I just want to let you know I represent the seller. They're my client. And the buyer says, great, let's write it up anyways. At that point, I say, great. And I can treat him as a client as well. So when I represent the buyer and the seller, or a tenant and an owner in the same transaction, that's called a dual agency. Now, not every broker will allow dual agency. So let's say there's a broker that does not allow dual agency. How does that work? Well, let's go back to our example. Let's say that I'm the listing agent. I'm doing an open house. A prospective buyer comes through and the buyer says, listen, Paul, I want you to write up the offer. And I say, well, here's the deal. The seller is my client and I represent them. I cannot represent you. I cannot give you those fiduciary duties, but you can be a customer. And here's what being a customer means. I have to be fair and honest and all those things we talked about in part one of this series. All right. So that way there, I'm representing the seller, and then the buyer is a customer. I owe the seller all the fiduciary duties. I owe the buyer all the duties that the law requires that I give to the buyer. And again, we talked about that in that first video. All right. Now, one thing I need you to know here, here's an asterisk. Dual agency. For dual agency to be authorized or to be legal, all parties in the transaction have to agree to dual agency in writing, meaning the buyer and the seller and both brokers, or all the brokers involved in the transaction, have to agree and simply say, it just simply means that they're all authorizing dual agency, but that authorization has to be in writing. It cannot be verbal. All right. And then the last one I want to talk about is subagency. Subagency isn't used too much anymore, but it still does exist. And let me map this out. Let's say we have 123 Main Street up for sale, and I am the listing agent. All right. And I work for 123 Main Street brokerage firm. And I put it out on the network, or the multiple listing service. So we have hundreds and hundreds of buyer's agents out there from many, many different companies. They all represent, or they all have buyer clients. Under subagency, all of these buyer's agents represent my seller. So what does that mean? That means every one of these buyer's agents, they owe my seller all these fiduciary duties, those 6 fiduciary duties that we talked about in part 1 of this video series. All right? Agency can be very complicated at times, no doubt, and it's very difficult to learn sometimes, and that's why I kind of map it out the way I do. And if you agree with me, give this video a thumbs up. But subagency, then all the buyer's agents out there represent my client, meaning they owe my client, the seller, fiduciary duties, even though the listing is with a different company. These are all different companies. Company 1, Company 2, Company 3, Company 4. 4 different companies involved, but they all represent my seller. Now again, like dual agency, there has to be an authorization in writing for that to exist. Now, the question is, buyer agent number 1, they've been representing their buyer now for 2 weeks, showing them a ton of homes. They don't know me, and they don't know my seller. So they represent, obviously, as a limited buyer's agent, they represent their buyer, but they also represent my seller as a limited seller agent. So that means once the deal gets started here, then it's going to go to dual agency. Remember, if you represent both parties in the same transaction, it ends up being dual agency. And that would require the informed written consent of all the parties involved. Subagency can be very confusing at times, but you do have to know subagency for the real estate licensing exam. All right, the next classification of agency I want to talk about is what we call general agency. General agency. Now, a couple of things we have to know about general agency. Number 1 is it's an ongoing relationship. Ongoing. And number 2 is the licensee can speak on behalf or for the client. All right, now under special agency, remember it was limited time, limited purpose, limited authority in one specific act. And once that one specific action ended, then their relationship is done. But under general agency, that agency relationship continues. Now, where do we see this the most common? It's in property management. So, and it doesn't matter the type of real estate that the licensee is managing. General agency is typically what you see. Now, let me give you an example and why it's important. And one other thing I want to point out here, you can speak on behalf of your client, but there is limits on what you can and can't do on behalf of your client. And here's what I mean. Let's say that I am managing a single family home for an owner. It's a rental property, a single family rental. And every time there is a maintenance item and I need to spend $5 or $10 on a washer, I would literally, under special agency, I would have to go get the permission of the owner. That's just not practical. So many times what property managers will do is they'll have a certain threshold or a dollar amount in the management contract that says any maintenance up to, let's say, $300 or $500, then I, as the licensee, I can make those decisions without contacting the owner. Anything above a certain dollar amount, then I will have to contact the owner to get permission to do it. So from a practical point of view, it makes sense, but there are some limits on how much you can speak on behalf of the client. The third classification is called universal agency. Universal agency, or sometimes known as common law agency. Every state kind of has their own verbiage here. Now, it looks a lot like general agency on steroids. All right, so it's an ongoing relationship, and you can speak on behalf or speak for your client. And the authority is much greater than general agency. Actually, under universal agency, it's a power of attorney. And many times the authority of the licensee goes beyond the actual real estate transaction. They can buy vehicles for the property management company and things like that. And the other thing to remember about both general agency and universal agency is if the licensee makes a decision for the owner, that decision is binding on the owner. So let me give you an example. Let's say I have a universal agency with an investor of mine, and I see a great or what I think is a great real estate deal. And so I buy that piece of property because I have the authority to do that on behalf of my owner. The owner turns around and sees the property and says, oh, no, I don't like this property. Well, guess what? They're going to buy the property because I have the legal right to bind them under a universal agency. Now, the fourth classification of agency I want to talk about is called implied. So this is number 4, implied. Now, implied agency goes by a couple of different names. And I'll put them down here in the notes here on the screen. It can also be called agency by estoppel or ostensible agency. And again, you need to know that because you don't know how the real estate exam is going to phrase the questions. This simply means by implication, you represent somebody. And let me give you just a weird example of where you might see this. Let's say that I have 123 Main Street listed for sale and I'm doing an open house. A potential buyer comes through and says, I really don't like this house, but I love your neighbor's house. And you say, whether it's true or not, you say, oh yeah, I have this house for sale. So you want to write an offer, and the prospective buyer says yes. So you sit down with the prospective buyer, you write up an offer. Then you take the offer to the neighbor and say, hey, I got an offer for you. Now the neighbor could say, done. Nope, go away, house is not for sale. Or they could say, great, let's take a look at it. Well, there's nothing in writing with you and the neighbor saying that you represent them in the transaction, but by implication, because they're moving forward with the sale, then by implication, you are their agency, or you're their agent. So that's implied agency. So you become the agent and they become your client. Now, once you put everything into writing, then it's called agency by ratification. Now, in many, many states, this is not legal, but I do want to point it out because I do hear every once in a while students that'll have that question or a version of that question on their licensing exam.